Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is standing in front of an escalator and a staircase and choosing the escalator. Not because they're tired, not because they're carrying something heavy, just because the escalator is there and the stairs require effort, and some part of their brain, operating below the level of conscious thought, made a decision before they even realized there was a decision to make. That person is going to feel slightly guilty about it. Maybe they'll tell themselves they'll take the stairs next time. Maybe they'll think about the gym membership they're not using. Maybe they'll scroll past a fitness post later and feel the particular brand of low-level shame that has become one of the defining experiences of being alive in the modern world. Here's what nobody tells them. They're not lazy, they're not undisciplined, they're not failing at anything. They're doing exactly what 2 million years of human evolution built them to do. And the ancient human, who is their direct ancestor, the one who actually lived the life the fitness industry keeps telling you to return to, would have made exactly the same choice. Without hesitation, without guilt, and with the full support of every survival instinct in their body. Professor Daniel Lieberman has spent decades studying this question. He's a Harvard evolutionary biologist who has studied extinct humans and living hunter-gatherers for years, and he's written extensively about what physical activity actually looked like for most of human history. His conclusion is simple and genuinely uncomfortable for the entire fitness industry. Exercise, as we currently think about it, voluntary physical activity done specifically for health, with no other goal, is a modern invention. It did not exist for most of human history. Not because ancient humans were lazy, because exercising for its own sake, in a world where every calorie matters, is an extraordinarily strange thing to do. Lieberman puts it directly. When people don't exercise, we label them as lazy, but they are actually doing what we evolved to do, which is to avoid unnecessary physical activity. Your deeply embedded human instinct during downtime, he argues, is to be as inactive as possible. That instinct wasn't a flaw, it was the strategy that kept your ancestors alive. Here's the math that makes this make sense. For most of human prehistory, food was not guaranteed. You didn't know when the next meal was coming. You couldn't order delivery. You couldn't open a refrigerator. The calories you had access to today were the calories you had, and there was no certainty about tomorrow. In that context, burning calories unnecessarily isn't a character flaw. It's a survival mistake. Every calorie your body burns on activity it doesn't need to do is a calorie that isn't available for the things your body actually requires. Keeping your heart beating, your brain working, your immune system running. In a world of caloric uncertainty, the body that conserves energy whenever possible outlasts the body that burns it frivolously. Which is exactly why your body is so good at finding reasons not to move when it doesn't have to. This goes back further than Homo sapiens. A 2016 study published in Nature showed that chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are inactive for around 10.5 hours out of every 1-2-hour active day. Our ape ancestors evolved for low energy expenditure to suit life in a rainforest. When climate change pushed our ancestors out of those forests and onto open grasslands around 7 million years ago, we evolved to walk on 2 legs and burn more calories, but the underlying impulse toward inactivity, the preference for rest whenever rest was possible, came with us. It was already ancient before we were human, and it's still running in you now. But here's where it gets complicated, because the picture isn't as simple as ancient humans did nothing. They did move, a lot, actually, but not the way we move when we exercise. Studies of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, whose physical lives give researchers the closest available window into how prehistoric humans actually spent their days, show that Hadza men walk roughly 8 to 11 miles per day. Hadza women walk around 4 to 6 miles. Those are significant numbers. Significant enough that, on the surface, it sounds like hunter-gatherers were getting enormous amounts of physical activity. But here's the crucial detail. None of it was exercise. All of it was purposeful. Every step had a reason attached to it. Walking to where food was, walking back with what they found, covering the distance between this camp and the next water source, carrying a child, carrying what they gathered, moving because there was somewhere to go and something to get. The moment there was no immediate reason to move, they stopped moving. Researcher David Reichlin at the University of Arizona, who has studied Hadza activity patterns extensively using GPS trackers and accelerometers, describes this clearly. The Hadza are active when they need to be, and when they don't need to be, they rest. The rest isn't laziness, it's biology. What did that rest actually look like? This is the part that gets left out of every fitness article that cites hunter-gatherers as evidence that we should all be moving more. Between bouts of necessary movement, ancient humans rested. They sat, they lay down. They slept during the day when the sun was at its peak and the heat made everything harder. They groomed each other, which is both social bonding and physical rest simultaneously. They talked, they napped. The idea that our ancestors were in constant motion, endlessly active, hunting and running and climbing every hour of every day, is a fantasy. The archaeological and anthropological evidence doesn't support it. The actual pattern is bursts of intense, purposeful activity followed by significant rest, which interestingly is also what modern exercise science has increasingly identified as the most effective approach to fitness. Short, intense intervals followed by recovery periods outperforms long, steady-state activity for most health outcomes. The training pattern our prehistoric ancestors stumbled into by accident of survival necessity turns out to be more effective than the chronic low-intensity movement most fitness culture promotes. But that's beside the point. Ancient humans weren't doing interval training. They were resting because they were tired from necessary activity, and resting when tired is what sensible bodies do. Now, let's talk about a study that should have broken the internet but somehow didn't. In 2012, Herman Poncer at Duke University and colleagues published a paper in the journal PLOS ONE comparing the total daily energy expenditure of Hadza hunter-gatherers with people living in the United States and Europe. The expectation going in was obvious. Hunter-gatherers move more, so they must burn more calories. You'd assume a significant gap between the active Hadza and the largely sedentary Westerners. The result was not what anyone expected. After controlling for body size, the Hadza burned roughly the same number of calories per day as Westerners. The same. A population walking 8 to 11 miles per day in the African savannah burns approximately the same daily calories as a person who drives to work, sits at a desk for 8 hours, and goes home. How is that possible? The answer, Poncer's research suggests, is that the human body adjusts. When the Hadza move more, their bodies compensate by spending less energy on other internal processes, inflammation, stress hormones, reproductive activity, things your body dials back when it needs to redirect that budget toward movement. When you sit all day, your body apparently redirects that energy toward those other processes instead. This doesn't mean physical activity doesn't matter for health. It clearly does, in ways that go far beyond calorie burning. But it does completely undermine the simple story that our ancestors were burning vastly more calories and that's why they were healthier. The gap between the Hadza and you is more complicated and more interesting than a simple step count. There's one more piece of this that I think is the most important. Hunter-gatherers never exercised for health. They moved for food, for safety, for shelter, for social reasons. And here's what the research shows actually happened to their bodies as a result. They were extraordinarily fit. A 2017 study of ancient arm bones from female Neolithic farmers found that their bone strength significantly exceeded that of modern female athletes, including current Cambridge University rowing team members. These weren't people doing bicep curls. These were people who spent years digging, carrying, hauling, and grinding, and their bones showed it in ways that modern elite athletes' bones don't. Reichlin's work with the Hadza shows they have better cardiovascular health than their age-matched Western counterparts on almost every measurable metric, despite the fact that by our cultural standards, they rest an enormous amount. The fitness came as a byproduct of a life structured around necessary physical tasks, not as the goal of a deliberate health regimen, not as something scheduled between meetings. Just as the unavoidable physical consequence of doing the things that needed doing to survive. And the moment those things stopped being necessary, the moment technology removed the need for physical effort, the fitness went with them. Not because of moral failure, not because of lack of discipline, because the body is extraordinarily good at not doing things it doesn't have to do. Let me give you a number that reframes this entire conversation. In a comprehensive review of physical activity data from hunter-gatherer and subsistence farming populations published in the American Journal of Human Biology, researchers found that the average person in a pre-industrial society spent somewhere between 2.5 and 5 hours per day in moderate to vigorous physical activity. That sounds like a lot, until you look at what the other 19 to 21 hours were doing. Sleeping, sitting, resting. Activities that most fitness messaging would categorize as sedentary. The framing we've absorbed from modern wellness culture is that our ancestors were constantly active, that they lived lives of ceaseless physical effort, and that we've betrayed that heritage by developing comfortable chairs and delivery apps. The research doesn't support this framing. What the research shows is intermittent activity embedded in a large amount of rest, which is completely different from the chronic low-intensity movement that gets promoted as the ancestral ideal, and also different from the intense daily gym sessions that get sold as the modern equivalent. Ancient humans worked hard when work was required and did almost nothing when it wasn't. Their bodies were fit because the work, when it happened, was genuinely demanding. Not because they were committed to a fitness philosophy. The Hadza don't have a word for exercise. They have words for hunting, for gathering, for walking to the water source. The activity and its purpose were the same thing. There was no category of movement done specifically for health independent of any other goal. That concept didn't exist. It's a genuinely modern invention. And Lieberman would argue it had to be invented precisely because everything else that used to make movement unavoidable got removed. There's also something worth saying about what ancient rest actually did for the body, because it wasn't passive in the way we often imagine. When the Hadza rest, which they do frequently, and without apparent guilt, they're not sitting in ergonomic chairs, staring at screens. They're sitting on the ground, which requires continuous low-level muscle activation to maintain posture. They're shifting position regularly. They're engaged in social interaction, grooming, manual tasks like tool maintenance or food preparation, all of which involve movement that registers as rest by the standards of the day, but would look like activity by the standards of an office worker. The kind of rest ancient humans took was fundamentally different from the kind of rest modern humans take. Modern sedentary rest involves sitting in a chair designed to require almost no muscular effort, looking at a screen for hours without changing position. The average American sits for somewhere between 6 and 8 hours per day in this kind of genuine physical inactivity. That's not what hunter-gatherer rest looked like. Their inactivity was more active than ours. The floor instead of a chair, the hands doing something instead of holding a phone, the body shifting and moving without any particular intention, simply because there was no infrastructure specifically designed to remove all physical requirement. Researchers who study the physiological effects of sitting, a field that has expanded dramatically in the past 2 decades, have found that the problem isn't sitting itself so much as sustained static sitting without interruption. Brief, regular movement breaks have an outsized positive effect on metabolic health relative to their small size, which happens to be exactly the pattern of activity that unavoidably structured hunter-gatherer rest. They weren't managing their sedentary time. They were just living in an environment that didn't permit the kind of sustained, static inactivity that modern life has made the default. And there's one last thing worth knowing, because it changes the moral weight of this entire conversation. The guilt around exercise and physical activity is a remarkably recent invention. For most of human history, physical effort was a necessity, not a virtue. Nobody praised a hunter-gatherer for how hard they worked out. Nobody celebrated a Neolithic farmer for their commitment to an active lifestyle. They moved because they had to, they rested because they could, and neither required a value judgment. The idea that your worth as a person is related to how much you voluntarily suffer through physical activity, that taking the escalator is a small moral failure, and going to the gym is a form of self-improvement that says, Something good about your character is a product of a specific cultural moment, not an ancient truth your ancestors would recognize. Lieberman is quite pointed on this. The modern fitness industry, he argues, has taken a genuine health need, regular physical activity, which our bodies require, and wrapped it in a moral framework that does more harm than good. Making people feel guilty about not exercising has not, as a strategy, produced a world in which more people exercise. It has produced a world in which most people cycle between guilt and inaction, occasionally interrupted by bursts of overambitious effort that don't last. The evolutionary perspective, if it does anything useful here, is to strip that moral layer away. You are not lazy. You are not failing. You are a body that was built for a world that no longer exists, trying to function in a world that constantly removes the conditions that used to make movement unavoidable. That's a design mismatch, not a character defect. The person who understands that and figures out how to add movement back into their life without the moral scaffolding will probably do better than the person who keeps trying to guilt themselves into consistency, which is, admittedly, not the most motivating thing anyone has ever said about fitness. But it might be the most honest. Let's talk about what actually happens to a body that was built for one world and placed in a completely different one. Because this is where the evolutionary story stops being interesting in a historical sense and starts being personal in a very immediate way. The diseases that kill the most people in the modern world, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, certain cancers, depression, are not random misfortunes. They are, at least in significant part, diseases of mismatch. Conditions that emerge when a body shaped by millions of years of one set of physical demands is placed in an environment that has removed almost all of those demands overnight. In evolutionary terms, Daniel Lieberman calls these diseases of comfort. And the phrase is precise in a way that the word lifestyle disease isn't, because lifestyle implies choice. Comfort implies a system that was working exactly as designed until the conditions changed around it. Your cardiovascular system was built to run, to carry things, to cover long distances on foot. When it doesn't do those things, not because you're choosing not to, but because the world has been redesigned so that it's never necessary, it starts doing things it wasn't built for. Storing fat in places it shouldn't be stored. Developing insulin resistance. Building up plaque in arteries that were supposed to be regularly cleared by physical effort. This isn't weakness, it's engineering. The system was built with certain inputs, assumed. Remove the inputs, and the outputs change. The Hadza don't have cardiovascular disease at the rates modern Western populations do, not because they're morally superior or because they're living some idealized version of the ancestral life, but because the physical demands of their daily existence happen to provide their cardiovascular systems with something close to what those systems were built to receive. And here's the detail that I find most clarifying about all of this. It's not primarily about intense exercise. The research on Hadza health outcomes shows that what seems to matter most is what researchers call low-intensity, habitual physical activity. The baseline of movement that was unavoidable throughout the day in a hunter-gatherer existence, the walking, the carrying, the crouching and rising and shifting position, not the sprinting, not the hunting, not the intense physical effort. The thing your body most needs, it turns out, isn't the hour in the gym. It's the background hum of movement that used to fill every hour of every day and has now been almost completely eliminated by design. Chairs, cars, elevators, delivery services, remote controls. Each individual technology solving a specific problem, and the aggregate effect of all of them together being the removal of almost every occasion for the kind of movement the human body runs best on. Nobody designed modern life to make people sick. They designed it to be convenient. And convenient, for a body that evolved to resist unnecessary effort, turns out to mean sedentary. The escalator wasn't built to harm you, it was built to help you. And in a different body, a body that didn't have 2 million years of energy conservation programming, it probably would be neutral. But in the body you actually have, The escalator is one of 10,000 small decisions made by 10,000 different engineers and designers, each one removing one more occasion for the kind of movement your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your musculoskeletal system, and your mental health system were all built to receive daily. The cumulative effect of those decisions is the health gap between the Hadza and the average person sitting in a developed country right now. Not a gap in discipline, a gap in what the environment automatically demands of the body. The person at the bottom of the escalator choosing the escalator is not demonstrating a character flaw. They're demonstrating that the hardware running their decision works exactly as intended. The question isn't how to feel bad enough about that to override it. The question is how to design a life that makes necessary movement unavoidable. Again, the way it used to be unavoidable for every human who came before you. Not because you should suffer, because your body was built to function best when it moves regularly, and it will not remind you to do that. It will, in fact, actively encourage you not to. That's not a bug. It's the oldest feature there is.